Welcome to today's Q&A panel discussion on innovation in water management, the future of the Murray-Darling Basin. I'm Professor Mike Stewartson, the Chief Executive for the One Basin CRC, and I'm very pleased to be moderating the panel discussion, which is co-hosted by the One Basin CRC, Water Research Australia, and the Australian Water School. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri, Wurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I invite anyone online to share the country you are joining us from via the chat function at the bottom of your screen. I'd also like to acknowledge that we have people joining us from around the world, over 54 countries. We've got 1,100 people registered to attend online or to listen to the recording following the session, which is great to see. So a large number of people online from around the world today. I'll introduce the panelists in a minute, but I just want to start with a bit of context for the panel discussion. In the latter part of the 20th century, the evidence that the Murray-Darling Basin was in trouble was stacking up with sequences of crises related to water security, pollution from nutrients and salinity, and declining river health. In response to those problems, beginning in the mid-1990s, basin governments led water reforms which have underpinned innovation in all aspects of water management over the last 30 years. As the Productivity Commission reported in its 2020 review of the Australia's national water reform journey, good progress has been made, but there is more work to be done, including some new challenges which have emerged in recent years. And we'll be talking about those over the course of the next hour. In short, there is an ongoing need for innovation in water management. We know that tackling big water management challenges requires collaboration across disciplines, sectors, and communities. So that's why 85 organisations from across a broad range of sectors have joined together to establish the One Basin Cooperative Research Centre, or CRC. The One Basin CRC is a not-for-profit research and development organisation where partners work together to grow value from water. Noting that we define value broadly, including economic, social, cultural, and environmental dimensions. Our vision is a sustainable, productive, and resilient basin. The One Basin CRC commenced in July 2022 with funding commitments from the Commonwealth CRC program and our partners totaling $145 million over 10 years. In this CRC, we've got a particular focus on place-based research in 4 regional hubs across the Murray-Darling Basin, and we'll be exploring this regional approach to water innovation as part of the discussion today. All our panelists today are part of the One Basin CRC, along with other roles they have wearing different hats. So I'd like to introduce the panel now, if they would like to switch on their cameras. First, Dr. Raylene Ward is a director of the One Basin CRC, and she also leads First Nations engagement as the knowledge broker with the Southern Queensland and Northern New South Wales Drought Resilience Hub. Raylene is a proud Aboriginal Kunya woman, a traditional owner of Cunnamulla and surrounding areas in Western Queensland. Karen Hutchinson is the irrigated agriculture industry convener with the One Basin CRC and is also part of the senior management team at Murrumbidgee Irrigation Limited. Professor Seth Westra is research director for the One Basin CRC and professor of hydrology and climate risk at the University of Adelaide. And Professor Jeff Cockfield is the capability and commercialisation program leader with the One Basin CRC and formerly executive director of the Institute for Resilient Regions at the University of Southern Queensland. So welcome to the four of you. So just a reminder to please put your questions into the Q&A and I'll move on to those as the questions start to come in. But first, I'd like to start by talking about some of the drivers and opportunities for water innovation, looking at this from different perspectives. So Jeff, a question for you to start with. What are some of the drivers for innovation in water management being experienced by rural regions and their economies?
Thanks, Mike, and hello to everyone. I think you've referred to the changes, and we'll talk about those over the last 20 to 30 years in the basin. But a primary driver of water innovation, water management innovation, is having to do more with less, and that has several aspects. And one is a recognition that historical water users have to share more. We have more diverse claims on water use, whether that be for First Nations people, recreational activities, towns, and so on. So there's the demand side has expanded, and also we have competition within the ag sector due to diversification of the different crops, and particularly shifting from annual crops to more stable tree crops, and therefore the demand for water is much more constant there. Terms of trade in agriculture have also driven change, and that's simply the fact that costs of production have increased at a greater rate than prices for commodities. And this is especially true in relation to energy costs, and energy costs are a lot to do with water. It's hard to move and heavy to move. On the other hand, we expect supply constraints due to climate change and decreased inflows, and that's well mapped out in this area. And last of all, expectations, social and political expectations, that people who are water users should justify or continue to conform with social license to use that water. And that means demonstrating responsible use, and that can be done through self-driving declarations, but it can also be done through increasing uses of accreditation around water use.
No, thanks, Jeff. A good summary and overview of the challenges. More from less being the headline there. Raylene, a question for you from a First Nations perspective. What are the priorities for innovation in water management in regional areas of the Murray-Darling?
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everybody to our first webinar. And we're pleased to be here. So, in relation to your question, Mike, from a First Nations perspective, I think what is important straight up is making sure that we acknowledge First Nations people as not only stakeholders in the Murray-Darling Basin, but also as, traditional custodians of the land of where the Murray-Darling Basin sits. We acknowledge that we have more than 42 traditional owner groups that sit across the entire Murray-Darling Basin. So it's important that we not only acknowledge, their historical existence in this landscape, but also acknowledge them as water rights holders. They certainly haven't been participating at the same level that we see more effort and focus in relation to, water and incorporating, new innovative cultural practices. So they're being looked upon to be able to share their cultural knowledge around, how to manage water, how to manage land, how to manage country, and, cultural significance of those particular areas across the Murray-Darling. First Nations people hold a deep connection to country. As we know, they are the traditional custodians of Australia. The river systems, in the Northern Basin and in the Southern Basin are two very different experiences, and that comes with different stories that we hear from First Nations people. So we're listening quite intently about, what are those experiences of First Nations people across the Murray-Darling. Not only is water culturally, spiritually, and economically important to First Nations people, but it's also important for the well-being and the health of our communities that exist across that region as well. We are working with First Nations Australians to increase their ownership of water and to take part in, better policy decision making, in encouraging their participation at all levels when we talk about water management, but also innovation. There are projects that we can also speak to, which I will expand on down the track. And I think on the last part of that question, I think Australians, worldview, or First Nations worldview, and our connection to country provides a very deep and rich source of knowledge and innovation and how to better manage land and water. But how do we ensure that First Nations people's voices are, at the forefront of everything that we speak to?
Thanks, Raylene. Appreciate the answer. So we've heard from the drivers from a rural economy's perspective. We've heard from a First Nations perspective. Karen, perhaps you can give us a water utility perspective, given your role at Murray-Darling Irrigation. What are the priorities for innovation in water management in regional areas of the Murray-Darling?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I guess I want to go back a little bit because you touched on water reform, and there's no doubt that water reform and the various changes over decades has had a real impact on the changing face of rural irrigation and irrigation infrastructure operators. And just for those that are not familiar with the basin in the Murrumbidgee irrigation area, for example, we started out with water being tied to land and particular crop types only being able to be grown in particular districts. And that's all changed with these decades of water reform. And probably the key to that has been that property right for water, which has enabled water trade, which has enabled a separation of water and delivery rights, which has really changed the business of water delivery to be a delivery company rather than a water utility that owns the water and sorts out where the water goes. That change to a property right has really changed the driver, which is largely our customers. And it is a driver for efficiency. So Jeff pointed out to changing climate and changing demands and changing commodity demands. But it also meant that they were able to change crop types and change how and when they irrigate water. And that then flows onto the infrastructure operator. So we need also to be agile and to be able to look at our system differently and to be able to update the way that we operate things from a very manual, gravity-fed delivery network to something that actually includes technology and integration and delivery decisions that can meet the needs of the changing customer base that we have. So we can have customers here that are growing a tree crop one year and choosing to grow cotton into the future. So being able to change to meet the demands of the customers at the service levels that they need, at the flow rate they need, at a price that they can afford, is all driving innovation across our business from a business perspective, but also from a water efficiency perspective going into a dry future.
Thanks, Karen. Excellent. And maybe from you, Seth, too, your views on this. So recognising that we have had this 30 years of innovation that Karen and Jeff both spoke about, has it all been done? Are we reaching diminishing returns? Have we exhausted all the options for innovation in water management, or is there more work to be done?
I mean, that's a great question. Thanks, Mike, and hello to everyone in the audience. So there's different ways to, I guess, tackle that question. I think maybe transporting ourselves to a different sector firstly, and think about the tech sector in the 90s. And at that point, we'd had they'd invented the internet. We'd got the World Wide Web. We'd miniaturized computers, so everyone could have a computer in their home. You could easily say, okay, innovation's done. We've done this project. We can move on. But the reality is, for any system, and Jeff alluded to this in his answer, we live in a competitive landscape, and there's lots of drivers of change that we've already heard about, and we need to keep on innovating. We need to keep on thinking differently, and so we can't. I think we can't stop this innovation project. Now, have we reached diminishing returns? That's hard to say, because it's always hard to know where the next innovations come from and what drives that. And so the first, I think, response to that is how do we build an innovation system where you're connecting bright people, giving them pathways to do really exciting things and think differently about the problems that we've had. There are lots of opportunities, I think, still for innovation, though. And
the drivers that we've talked about, or that Jeff and Raylene and Karen have talked about, provide some of those seeds to those opportunities. We've got climate change, which is it's a major challenge, but that's also driving an energy transition, which provides some very significant opportunities to do things differently. We've had the digitization transition, which is still ongoing and will continue to drive change. That's providing all sorts of opportunities in terms of how we, for example, operate our water, how we move water around the basin, and how we use information better. So there's lots of opportunities there. There's potential economic drivers. This idea of using, getting more out of less, and really needing to value water potentially leads to opportunities for thinking about new water sources, whether it's underground water or otherwise impaired water, and thinking about how do we sort of get access to different types of water, for example, to have a bit more of a portfolio approach rather than relying on a single sort of water resource. So there's a lot of opportunities. A lot of those come from both the challenges and some of these other transitions that occur. But I think the fundamental ingredient is that we need to work out how to get right people together to really create an innovation system by which some of those innovations can occur.
Seth, while we're talking to you, there's a question that's come in relation to climate change. You mentioned climate change as a driver, as did at least Jeff and possibly the others. How do you think about climate change in the context of innovation in water management? And the question is, how well do we understand the implications of future climate and on how we best manage water in the basin? So especially around the uncertainty around climate futures and what that means and the potential scale of those implications, and what does that mean for innovation processes and systems?
So climate change, there's really two dimensions to climate risk. There's the physical risk that I think this question probably touches on more, and there's the transition risk, which links to things like the energy transition, but also a whole range of other things that affect farm systems. If we focus on the physical risk, there's a range of projections for the basin, but on average, projections are that the basin will dry more and potentially also become more variable. So you have more swings, extremes. What does that then mean? Well, I guess the first thing is necessity is the mother in innovation. So this forces us to think. We need to think cleverly about how we deal with a potentially diminishing water resource and still achieve good outcomes for community, for environment, and so on and so forth. So that's certainly there, and that's why we're looking at things like whether it's managed for recharge or otherwise accessing other sorts of water resources to sort of provide that diversification to help deal with some of the impacts of climate change. It is possible that through the market reforms, water might become more expensive. I'm not going to predict water markets, so please don't treat that as a prediction. But if you have a finite resource that becomes increasingly scarce, it gets valued more. That can then also unlock certain things that have been previously too expensive to do, certain reforms, certain innovation. So there's a whole range of different, dimensions there. But I think the key is the climate science is becoming a lot more clear than it has been in the past. And so I think we sort of have a sense of what the future is and what it's going to hold. And so it's a thing that we need to tackle collectively and put our heads together to work out how we get good outcomes given some of those challenges.
Thanks, Seth. Jeff, back to you for another question. There's a range of options we know that are around for innovation, innovation technology and energy, and a range of things related to groundwater are also possible. And we'll probably get into some of those details a bit later. But what are the enablers that allow these innovations to be realised, to be achieved? We sort of see significant barriers to them progressing from ideas to actual applications and applications at scale. What does research tell us about the enabling conditions that helps to translate these ideas into practice?
Thanks, Mike. Adoption's a complex thing because there's so many factors at play and so much variation amongst the target groups. So whether they be end users or people or resource managers. But I think a primary thing, perhaps covering a lot of those, is the innovation something that will fit with the aspirations of the people who are targeted? And that might include, well, most likely includes profit or not, or avoiding loss, but that's only part of it. And so it can be things like, does it interfere with their recreational preferences, their culture, and there are many subcultures there, lifestyle, and so on. So understanding that there's a variation in those aspirations is a very important part of it. But I think some of the things that can be done is you can increase the level of coordination. So some sort of strategic approach. If we identify something that we believe to be beneficial and it's been kind of tested and perhaps there's a demand for it, some sort of coordination, because we probably have a relatively fragmented innovation system across the basin, or systems plural. We're in a federal system, so we have state agencies, we have industry research bodies, we have private advisors of all kinds, commercial providers of technology and services, and they don't necessarily work together. And some degree of coordination is important, but probably also a qualification to that, and an important factor is to recognize that there is a lot of localization in how adoption happens. So conditions on the ground matter. So we need to pay attention to that. We need to maintain and use trusted influences in terms of affecting adoption. Over and over again, studies show that people pay attention to those they trust. So that building of relationships becomes very, very important part of that, and maintaining that relationship. You just can't come in and expect people to adopt an idea just because some experts arrive and tell you that it's a really good idea and show you that it's a good idea. It's who's local and who's trusted that matters as well. Addressing managerial constraints. So how do people's daily lives change as a result of the innovation that you think is good for them? Will life be harder? Will they have to do things differently? Do they have the confidence in their own skills to make changes, and so on? And also, I think the last thing I'd say is, when you're asking people to do something differently, to adopt something new, you're asking them to effectively change the way they work, and that involves changing their identity. How we live and how we work are our social identities. And so if you're wanting to influence that, you have to reframe people's social identities. A good manager of water does this, or a good farmer does that, or a person who cares about the environment, a fishing person who cares about the environment, adopts these practices. And so you're reframing how they see themselves and how they are comfortable with other people seeing them.
So much in that answer, Jeff, that we could unpick step by step. I mean, the question of identity is critical. It's a question, I've asked in terms of what researchers and what their identity is over several years. So thank you. Karen, I wonder if you could give us a bit of practical expression of what Jeff's just talked about. What does that look like on the ground? Can you give us some examples in your region in the Murrumbidgee of how that that regional innovation process can work to overcome some of those barriers?
Yeah, and I think perhaps, Mike, there's probably a couple of really nice examples there. I'll start with a simple one, and it's one that relates very specifically to an irrigation network, a channel network at that. So if you think about our supply network, we've got large earthen channels as well as small pipe channels and all sorts of things. But the large earthen channels, they get weeds. And for years, we have this problem. When there's weeds, it impedes the flow, it impacts the customer deliveries and a whole pile of things. So weeds are a problem for us. And we didn't really have a very good way of identifying in advance where these weeds were. Had a lot of weed management strategies. We did spraying, we do desilting with machines and digging them out. But when you're in season and there's water in the channel, you actually can't see where they are. But we drive along the channel banks anyway, trying to look for some sort of thing in the water that would show us there might be an impediment there, and then we'd send in machines and we'd sort things out. Or we'd just wait for a customer to start complaining and figuring that out. And I guess it comes back to Jeff's point about people that think differently. We brought someone into the business, and you'll hear the phrase of cross-boundary leadership becoming more and more common, and particularly throughout the CRC and the CRC language. When you bring somebody in from outside that's got a different way of looking at the problem, they can bring in new ideas. So in this case, we had someone who had skills in engineering and hydrology and a bit of a research background that understood things like channel roughness and started talking to our teams about Manning's N coefficients and ways that you can figure out whether your channel is slippery enough and the water's getting through, from a flow rate perspective. One thing led to another. It got a little bit of traction. We started building a tool. We've built a tool inside our organisation now where we can actually pinpoint where we might have channel restrictions based on an algorithm, a Manning-Zen algorithm. That was only part of the problem. Just on the money, you then actually have to get your operators to use it. So we have this lovely tool. We've built this lovely tool. It's based on science that's come from well-known science and well-known engineering and well-known hydrology from a different field. We've brought it into our system, and now we have to bring it down the chain. So it's then that you get to those experiences of social identity and management, and where you need to understand what do you need to make the change. And it comes down to trust and credibility. So we did that by setting up pilot studies, by demonstrating to our operators how things worked, by running things in parallel and then demonstrating over a period of time. So you need to be prepared to take the time and invest in the people, and also understand that the tool alone isn't enough. You actually need to implement the tool, and that involves people and the whole change management process that Jeff was talking to.
Thanks, Karen. Nice to get that pretzel example. I'm always pleased to hear examples that involve hydraulics as well. Raylene, there's some good questions coming through, which I'll move to in just a sec. But Raylene, in the context of these types of innovations, some of these are quite technological innovations. What are the opportunity for First Nations people to participate, to be involved, to lead? What does that look like from your perspective?
So I guess from a First Nations perspective, it's it's always keeping in mind that we've never seen as much involvement from First Nations people around participating in conversations, looking at tools, looking at new ways of managing water, incorporating cultural aspects or social, environmental and economical perspectives from a First Nations perspective. So I ask that we all always keep that in mind. And, even though we are traditional custodians of the land, we've always, seen and heard the stories of our ancestors and our, family members and our traditional owner groups speak about how land was managed and how water was managed back in the day. And also, even over the last 10 years, how we do things is always centered around, traditional stories, practices, the experiences are always there. It's how we incorporate them and how we translate cultural knowledge, to that Western science and understanding, and how we can work better together. I think for First Nations people, we have a huge opportunity through the One Basin CRC to look at how do we work with and incorporate cultural practices and knowledge from First Nations people across the entire basin. We are well positioned as a CRC to, build and enhance our connections to those traditional owner groups and those communities. We're doing that with some of the structure of the CRC around place-based hubs that we have located across the Murray-Darling. We're making sure that we position First Nations people within those hubs, but also, making sure that they're a part of, the larger community that we work with and that we engage with. Engaging with First Nations people has always been the priority for the CRC from the very outset. We've been able to, take advice and consider information from agencies that sit in the basin. And that's why we now have not only one First Nations director, but we have two that can represent across, the north and the south, but, build on those connections that we have. I think in relation to what Seth and Jeff and Karen were saying around innovation, I think there will always be an opportunity to encourage and support First Nations participation or involvement in whatever capacity, is, seen by community and people. And I think having, myself and Rowan, as part of the CRC, we're supportive of making sure that we speak to the rightful people, that we're engaging in the rightful way, and that we're doing things in a respectful way. So it's also about how do we develop partnerships and strengthen relationships with people.
Thanks, Raylene. Yeah, you characterise it well. This is probably one of the most exciting and greatest opportunities in the CRC. This challenge of how we are inclusive of First Nations people in basin science, in basin innovation and water management. This is the challenge of the next decade. And the CRC is in a good place to participate in that.
Yeah.
Seth, from a researcher's perspective, I know you've been thinking as a research director in the CRC about approaches to link research to innovation in water management to overcome some of those barriers to research translation and enable impact. Can you talk about some of the strategies that you think are going to be most effective to drive that translation of research to impact?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, the project that we're concerned with is really how do we build a strong innovation system? And as others have mentioned before, it really comes down to people as the fundamental sort of part of how we do that. So our strategies have focused on people first and foremost. And one of the key things that we've invested in very heavily is structuring a process of co-design around how we identify research challenges. So we've been talking at length with all the partners of the CRC as well as others about what are the key challenges that the basin faces, and then thinking about what are the niches, where can the One Basin CRC really play a role, and then how do we put diverse, interesting teams of people together to help co-design innovative, exciting solutions. And that part, I think, was probably one of the most exciting parts of our journey so far, is trying to create an environment where diverse groups of people from the research sector, but also from end users, from different communities, whole range of different skill sets, come together to work out how to add value to a particular area. The CRC has tried to provide some structure around that, so we've done training in co-design. We're investing in what Karen talked about before in terms of this boundary spanning leadership, because it's very much about sort of leading groups of people that are very diverse, because it's from that diversity that we learn about different perspectives and get some of those exciting ideas. So trying to wrap some of that support and also thinking carefully about how we evaluate potential investments of the CRC with impact front and center. So that's I guess the first strategy, really investing in co-design. The second one is around place-based research and making sure that a significant part of our research investment occurs within the regional hubs of the CRC. And so that really, again, is about people. It's fostering links to the local community. It's making sure that the researchers understand the local contexts, have the relationships, and so on and so forth. And so that idea of place-based research is very fundamental. And then finally, we're just keeping impact as, I guess, our sort of guiding light, if you like, of the CRC. And so we constantly ask ourselves, what's the impact pathway? How do we achieve impact? What's the thing that needs to change? Who's involved? Who can actually, it's not just the researchers themselves that can achieve the impact. It's the researchers working with other organizations to actually enable that impact. So how do we kind of create the environment for that to occur? So I think those are sort of the three strategies that I think come to mind is co-design, thinking about place-based research in the regional hubs, and then finally really making sure that impact is kind of the guide that drives, I guess, a lot of the discussions of how we decide to invest in research.
Thanks, Seth. I might attend to a couple of the questions that are coming through now in the Q&A, and I'll stay with you, Seth, while you're on. So there's a couple of questions about alternative water sources. One is, can we talk about wastewater treatment as a source of water, and whether we've got some comments on that. And another question is really, if we're trying to access other water sources, how might they disrupt ecosystems, and are the risks of that factored in? And that question actually goes a bit larger, is how are risks considered more broadly within the innovation process? So it's not just about benefits, there's also risks when we innovate.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important not to sort of be, what I call a sort of techno-optimist and assume that additional technologies is going to that's going to solve all our problems. Every innovation has its own risks and consequences, and often the next innovation is kind of trying to deal with some of those things that have happened before. So we need to be very clear-eyed about that. I guess really touching on that risk dimension, particularly, and the unintended consequences, there's a few strategies that we use. One is that's actually partly what the research is about. So how do we both design solutions that really carefully understand those risks and try to mitigate those, or even researching some of those risks so that we can kind of be more aware of the changes that are happening? Because a lot of these things, like access to brackish groundwater and so on, are probably going to happen anyway if the water becomes more scarce and so forth. And so, better to, I guess, be on the front foot of that and really understand what some of those consequences are than be reactive. The other part of that, again, is having that diverse team. And so looking at it from a policy angle, looking at it from an environmental angle, looking at it from First Nations perspectives. And so, again, having that diverse team to look at the problem from lots of different dimensions will hopefully help address some of those unintended consequences.
Thanks. Here's another question, which I'll just make an open question to anyone who thinks they can answer this one. I think this is a really interesting point. It probably is no definitive answer, but it's something that's worthwhile exploring. Is, has water management innovation led to the delivery of larger agricultural industry that is even then more sensitive economically to water vulnerability, to droughts at the expense of the environment? So is innovation somehow creating greater vulnerabilities by tightening the screws a little bit tighter? There's less slack in the system, I guess, is the idea that potentially presents risks in its own right.
I'll start, Mike, and then Jeff will probably jump in and save me. I think my short answer will be no. I think, if anything, innovation and technology, what that does is enable us to do more or better with less. And that point was made earlier. Perhaps examples, if you go back to our experience in irrigation districts through drought, what happens when you have a really big drought is things are really bad. People learn some really hard lessons. But if you have 2 droughts in a row, they change. And they look to technology and they invest in infrastructure on farm and they do things differently. So they identify what the biggest risk was. When you have it only once, you might think, well, it's once, it's a drought. When you have 2 in 10 years, you change. So you change your business model, you change how you're doing things. What we've seen is very much a mechanisation of agriculture that reduces all sorts of risks. We've also looked at water efficiency and how you do more with less. One of the things that Seth was alluding to with the risk management is that, and climate change, episodic events will become more and more. You need to think differently about your business and integrate those solutions into what you're going to do if it rains, if it doesn't rain. So I don't think so. If anything, what it's enabling us to do is to be more agile and look for different solutions in different places and continue to do the same or better with less and with technology. Jeff, you might have a different view.
A qualified view, I think, Karen. I think what's important to recognise is the overall impact. So at a sectoral level, I agree with Karen in terms of that adaptability, and particularly adaptability of quite a large chunk of enterprises. But innovation also accelerates the shakeout of sectors. And so what you actually get is innovation is essentially allows people to compete with each other, producers to compete with each other more and more intensively. And that means pressure comes on perhaps those enterprises or activities where there's more marginality either in management skill or economic resources or debt vulnerability or whatever the case may be, or climate change on marginal lands. And that can then lead to an accelerated adjustment of those industries, that the sector survives and continues to produce significantly, maybe even produce more, but there is a painful exit process and adjustment process that goes on. And the example at the moment would be smallholders in the wine industry in particular. So there's vulnerability, but it's not necessarily sectoral level vulnerability.
Well, thanks for that. While we're talking about risks and vulnerability, there's another question here on climate change that I might put. I suspect, Seth, you'll have an answer to this, but others may as well. Given the unpredictability of the climate now, looking forward, how accurate are the assumptions used in modelling scenarios used for decision making? I guess we're talking about significant planning decisions, investment decisions, whether that's environment, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of agriculture. What are some of these? How big are those assumptions, and what are some of the risks? How to manage those risks in now planning?
So I always like to say there's sort of two dimensions of physical climate risk. There's the change that we're expecting, and there's the increased uncertainty around what climate change will bring. And that uncertainty is inevitable. I mean, in the past, we would just assume that the historical climate would sort of continue, the swings and roundabouts of the past would just continue in the future. Now we need to use climate models and a whole range of different lines of evidence to work out what's likely to happen in the future. It's inevitable that will drive more uncertainty. And so that, I think, is actually one of the key impacts of climate change, is that we need to prepare for navigating a more uncertain environment. I think the broad brushstrokes, most climate models are saying a diminishing water, amount of water availability, so increased temperature, more potential evapotranspiration, so more water evaporating, but also potentially less rainfall, particularly in the southern basin. So the broad brushstrokes, we have a bit of a sense of that, but that's certainly not a definitive projection, and some of the changes might be relatively minor, but then there are projections that say, a catastrophic decline in water resources and everything in between. So that then comes back to the uncertainty question, and what that implies is that we really need to make sure that we have policies or solutions that are reasonably robust across a range of possible futures, rather than betting the house, if you like, or betting the farm, to use a better analogy, on a particular prediction of what the future will hold. And so it's how we manage our risk, how we hedge our risk, how we build resilience and robustness, I think, are the key discussions that we need to have.
Really nice. Wondering, in your role with the Drought Hub as the knowledge broker, with your engagement with First Nations people across the northern basin, what are the questions that are being asked about climate change and the concerns related to climate change that are really emerging in those discussions?
I guess the main conversation, and it's the same questions being asked over and over again, is around water. How in the northern part of the basin, we've got different landscapes that speak about experiences, of drought, and also speak about, experiences around flooding. But they're also asking more questions now around, how do we access water under particular licenses where, we currently can't capture some of the overflow, or how do we think about tapping into aquifers, or how do we think about accessing water through water banking initiatives, or innovative ways that we see happening in other countries. But there's some work being done in the northern part of, the basin in different communities. But I think there's a real determination about exploring these new and innovative ways, particularly around capturing, water that comes through a flood, that you can't be seen to tap into, or how do you tap into that groundwater without, making too much disturbance to, the natural ground, I guess. And from the First Nations perspective, it's exactly that: legislation, jurisdiction, policy, better understanding, what are the water rights and uses for First Nations people? How do we support collaboration between, farmers, the industry, irrigators, or even the ag sector to, work together with First Nations people so that we have more collaboration, which, historically has been quite limited. So there is a lot of talk around water, innovative ways. One of those, as an example, I'm working with, 5 landholders in the northern part of the basin, and one of our main challenges and question is better understanding water access and use and innovation, to be able to have a regional approach, with water use. So, it's innovative, but it's also, you get to be creative with how we consider collaboration for the future.
Thanks, Marlene. I mean, what really comes out of that is that holistic perspective that comes in these discussions with First Nations people, and they bring that strong holistic view. And there's an interesting challenge here that one question that was put to us around that the contrast between sort of reductive innovation processes focused on technology, on a single solution, versus a holistic landscape view to draw a broader challenge. And the question that was put, and I know, Raylene, whether you haven't asked this, or Seth, you may also have a view here too, is really what's the CRC thinking about in terms of, in fact, I'll just read the question: how does the CRC aim to address the key landscape function challenge for biodiversity and farm productivity, including engaging local community, First Nations, industry and government to work together to recognise local knowledge and needs, valuing natural capital, and how this in turn provides many environmental and farm productivity co-benefits. So a big, tricky question, but I wondered if you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, it is a big, tricky question, but it's also the example of where I'm sitting today, working, in my Drought Hub role as, knowledge broker for engagement with First Nations people. As I mentioned before, we've got 5 landholders across the Northern Basin that are very proactive around, giving up their land to, First Nations projects. So in my engagement in the Drought Hub, it's about how do we support not only First Nations people to think about the future and how they manage their land, but it's also about how do we support better collaboration with non-Indigenous people, in the sector. So this is we're doing a pilot project, initially to see what is viability around, growing produce, growing traditional food and medicine on each of those landholders' property. We're looking at how do we support the education and training of young people who are at risk or who are disengaged from school, who could certainly benefit from, working on country alongside non-Indigenous people, farmers, irrigators, botanists, around understanding, particular traditional foods that grow on, particular areas. We're not only looking at how do we deliver training, but we're also looking at how do we build capacity of First Nations people to participate in land management. It's not just managing the land, but it's also, looking at water rights, but also how do we create opportunities for First Nations people to be rangers of land management or rangers of water management. So there's a lot. I could go on, and I'm very excited about this being, it's gone from one property to a whole region now. So, we can collaborate not only in the Drought Hub, but with the CRC, but also with other agencies across the region.
Thanks, Raylene. The multiple benefits of those projects, are really striking. Any other responses to that question, or Jeff?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things going on with the CRC and the way we're approaching projects, and some of those include things like encouraging citizen science or working and developing citizen science around environmental matters as well, and that especially would include First Nations people. Projects related to instruments for green investment and related to water are looking at that kind of thing. And I guess generally looking at where we are doing research around innovations, it isn't necessarily just around water saving, but it would be based on our principles looking at multiple benefits, as we've just mentioned, the multiple benefits issue.
Thanks, Jeff.
Can I jump in on that, Mike, very quickly?
Yeah.
Because the one thing that Jeff missed in that was the integrated operations. So in addition to what Jeff and Raylene have said, something near and dear to our hearts is actually looking for how do you get those multiple benefits? And it was the cultural, the social, the productive, and the environment. And how do you use an integrated irrigation network to do that? Again, our experience at a local footprint level is when you think differently about your system and look for an integrated solution, you can do great things. And what we're looking to do is actually take that beyond an irrigation footprint to a catchment footprint and potentially to a southern basin footprint. So if you can get all of the operators working together to create multiple benefits and shared outcomes and be thinking about water not as somebody's water or lost water, but the water that we need to use to get multiple benefits from every megalitre, you can start to solve those sorts of problems. So it's actually around that agility and the integration of all of the thinking as well as the system.
That's a great example of the importance of collaboration across sectors to actually be able to implement some of the bigger opportunities in innovation. So thanks for that addition. Now, there are a lot more questions that have come through that I haven't been able to get to, and I know we're getting up to the hour. I will have to pull up just a moment. I'm going to ask this one more question, which is quite specific, and then we'll go to a bit of a general roundup. Maybe this is again for you, Karen. Is there an aim to end flood irrigation in the NBB?
That's a very specific question.
It's probably bad to have a specific question.
Probably the answer to that is it's horses for courses. So it depends what you're irrigating. What I've seen in the Murrumbidgee irrigation area over the 20 plus years that I've been living here is that technology does that for you. If it makes sense to flood irrigate, you'll flood irrigate, because what that means is you've got the right soils and you're growing the right crops, and you're going to keep the water in the subsoil, and you're going to get multiple uses out of that water. Where it doesn't make sense, people have converted to drip long ago. So technology and the market will do that for us.
Thanks, Karen. So just to round up, I just want to ask one more question of each of you, and if you give me a really quick answer, that'd be great. From your perspective, what do you hope will be a change we will see over the coming decade in regional water research and management? And perhaps we'll start with you, Karen, given you were just speaking.
I'll probably just reiterate my last and keep it tight for you, Mike, but it's integrated operations for me, and it's integrated at a catchment level, bringing in what we were talking about before. We need to help our operators reduce the uncertainty of their decision-making by not just having the right information, but knowing what to do with it and having the regulatory and other support frameworks that mean that they can make decisions that will be accepted and flow on through the system.
Thanks. Raylene?
I guess for, to sum everything up and think about First Nations people collectively and, thinking about the Murray-Darling Basin and, the work we do on the Drought Hub and the One Basin CRC, I I think we will certainly see a better future, around how we collaborate with First Nations people, how we build capacity of First Nations people and their communities to be able to continue to live and, engage with their historical stories. We will see projects that are beneficial and have some meaning to First Nations people, but it will also demonstrate better participation and, generous participation from First Nations people. I just have a lot of hope that, over the next 10 years or even in the next 5 years, we will start to see some change that is, relatable for our people in our communities.
Thanks, Raylene. Seth, one or two sentences.
Working together. So it's about building bridges between different communities, between the urban, the rural, between researchers and end users, et cetera, to create a really, really exciting ecosystem where people work together.
Yes.
More that co-design of research projects becomes routine in the basin where appropriate, that there's co-implementation of plans and policies so that the people affected are involved in that, and that we have an increasing sense of being citizens of the basin.
Thanks. Well, thanks to all the panelists, Karen, Raylene, Seth, and Jeff. Really interesting discussion. We didn't get to enough questions, and there was many other issues we could have spoken about, but what we did cover was really interesting. I really appreciate your thought and time and contributions. Thanks for all the audience who attended today, and for those who listen later to the recording. The recording link will be emailed to you and uploaded to the Australian Water School website and YouTube channel. As a live attendee, you're going to receive a certificate of attendance within the next 2 business days to count towards any continuing professional development hours you might be looking to build. There's going to be a short 1-minute survey will pop up when we finish the webinar, or you can scan the QR code on the screen to go straight to it now with your phone. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion today. We are planning more events like this in 2024. We're very, very happy to get your feedback and suggestions on what you'd like to hear about. There's so many topics that we would like to talk about. But that's all for today. So thank you everyone.